Alright, so we begin our next section, chapter 3 here, by looking at functional groups and the basics of nomenclature. What I mean by the basics of nomenclature here is in this chapter we will get into the nomenclature of our first functional group, which are alkanes. As we move throughout organic 1 and 2, what will happen is that we will study each of these functional groups in turn. When we study each of those functional groups, we will cover the nomenclature for those functional groups. But all of that nomenclature that we're going to learn is going to be based off of what we do today. So, first question, what are functional groups? These are one of the most basic things that you have to know to do organic chemistry, to understand organic chemistry, or to even be able to talk about organic chemistry. So functional groups are structural features, or in other words, pieces of a molecule, that allow for classification of organic molecules. So basically, these are going to allow us to categorize or organize our molecules based on certain pieces that we find in the structure. Now, before we get into these, there's a couple definitions we should know. And the first one is the term hydrocarbon. So hydrocarbon is a structure that contains exactly what the name makes it sound like. It's a structure containing just carbon and hydrogen. And many times when we're drawing, sort of generic molecules, functional groups, as we're going to in this lecture, you'll see that in a molecule we'll use this symbol R. Well, what is R? If you look on the periodic table, you're going to find that R doesn't appear anywhere on the periodic table. And that's because it's not an element. R is just a generic hydrocarbon group. So it could be 1 carbon, it could be 100 carbons. It's just some number of carbons, and we're just using R as an abbreviation. Now, also within molecules, we have what we refer to as primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary carbons. And this terminology is actually going to become fairly important to us when we get to spectroscopy, which is our next 3 major sections in this course, after we do some nomenclature. But these primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary refer to how many carbons are bonded to that carbon. So a primary carbon is a carbon that's bonded to 1 carbon and 3 hydrogens. Or we can show this with an R group. So R being some sort of hydrocarbon group, we have 1 of those and 3 hydrogens. If we have a secondary carbon, that's a carbon that's bonded to 2 hydrogens. And I'm going to designate this second group as R prime. Why is that? Well, that just means that that R group doesn't have to be the same as the other R group. They can be two different hydrocarbons. They can be the same, but by saying R and R prime, this way we know that they can be different. Tertiary is bonded to 3 carbons, and a quaternary is logically then bonded to 4 carbons. All right, so from here we're going to get into what our functional groups are. And we're going to start with some very basic functional groups. These are not all of the functional groups in organic chemistry. These are sort of the most important ones, the fundamental ones. But over time we will see others. And we'll need to know them as well. But for today, we're going to start with this basic set. So we have alkanes. I'm just going to list them to start. Alkenes, alkynes, and aromatics. I put these in this group because these are hydrocarbon functional groups. They don't involve any atoms other than carbon and hydrogen. We then will have a series of functional groups, which is a hydrocarbon bonded to some other atom. And these will include alcohols, ethers, amines, and thiols. And then we will have a series of functional groups where carbon is double bonded to oxygen. And these will include aldehydes, ketones, carboxylic acids, esters, and amides. And I forgot one in this column. We will also have alkyl halides. So basically, we've got about 14 basic functional groups to learn. So as I go through each of these functional groups, what I'm going to be doing is, we'll look at the functional group, we'll define what its structure is, and then after that, I'm going to give you some examples of, possibly an interesting molecule or an application of where you might find that functional group. What do you need to know from this? So you need to know the functional group. You need to be able to identify that functional group, or you need to be able to go the other direction, which is you need to be able to draw the functional group. You also need to be able to go the other way. So if you're given a molecule, you would need to be able to identify a given functional group. Or in many cases, some molecules have multiple functional groups in them. And so you need to be able to go in both directions. What you don't need to be able to do is you don't need to memorize this list of examples I'm going to give you. So each of these are presented as just sort of an example of this is where we find a functional group like this. So you can see it in some context, but you don't need to memorize these examples. So next video is where we're going to go through each of these functional groups, define them, and look at some examples.